Is this crazy? We stand on the verge of the 4 greatest years in the history. Make America great again. How can you be against it?
Okay, stop us if you've heard this before. The government is up against a deadline to pass a new spending bill before a shutdown that could happen at the end of this week. Welcome to Sidebar from the Washington Post. I'm Rhonda Colvin, here with my colleagues, columnist and editorial writer James Hohmann and JM Rieger, senior video journalist. Thanks, guys. On today's show, we're going to break down the looming government shutdown and how the scenario of a race against the clock is becoming commonplace, the politics behind it, and what are the ins and outs that we know of so far. We're also going to chat a little bit about J.D. Vance. He is actually on the Hill right now as we're taping this, or he may have just left. But we're trying to figure out what type of vice president is he becoming and what we know about him so far. So we will dive into that later. But first, let's start talking about the shutdown and what we know right now. I think a lot of people are wondering, why do we as reporters, keep saying there's a looming government shutdown? And I will fill in right now as a Capitol Hill reporter that there is a government funding deadline every September 30th. So this is an annual thing. But in the years past, we've seen it come down to the wire where they keep passing continuing resolutions or CRs that are just those kick the can down the road type of measures that just keep government funding at their current levels and just push back the deadline. So, JM, starting with you, why, from your reporting, why are we seeing these shutdowns come, to the last minute?
I mean, a shutdown in a nutshell is really just a failure to govern by Congress, right? Their first duty is to fund the government and keep the government open. So when they can't do that, that's really a breakdown of that process. But it's really a sign also of both the partisan nature of kind of the times that we're in and how divided the country is, and also how top down this process has become in Congress over especially the last couple of decades here. And what I mean by that is traditionally Congress, it would be very kind of sussed out to the committees. The committees would go through and allocate funding for their sort of expertise areas that they had oversight. And over the years, that's increasingly become a leadership top-down process where rank and file members do not have as much of a say in the process. So a shutdown becomes one of their few leverage points to really get any sort of say in the process or lobby for any sort of specific issues they might want in the bill.
Yeah. James,
as a journalist, deadlines focus me. So I think it's something, akin to that for lawmakers where you can have a lot of negotiations, but it's really hard to sort of have movement until the last minute. It's just the way a lot of negotiations work, where both sides have staked out positions and they're sort of hoping the other blinks first. But Congress has been so evenly divided that and polarized. A lot of, in the old days, when they had earmarks and stuff, it was easier to pass funding bills because you could do some good old fashioned log rolling where you kind of give everyone what they want. And for a long time, the way they've gotten out of this jam is to just give Republicans what they want, which is more defense spending and border enforcement, and give Democrats what they want, which is more social services, food stamps, education, programs like that. Mm-hmm. And so you just end up having a situation where then the bills become gargantuan because to get everyone to vote for it, everyone gets their priorities. And then you had in this post-Tea Party era, a bunch of people who came in as Republicans sort of promising to make government smaller and said they would never vote for one of these big spending bills. And so what that actually did in practice was it forced Republicans, when they were in control, to make concessions to Democrats to get their votes. But now you're seeing the dynamic sort of shift where a large group of people, the Congressional Freedom Caucus, sort of the most hardcore, now MAGA, but originally Tea Party people, they always voted no. And so they were sort of irrelevant in some ways because Republican leaders from John Boehner to Paul Ryan to Mike Johnson, Kevin McCarthy would have to go find some moderate Democrats or give stuff to Democrats to get them on board. Now, all of a sudden, if you can get the Republicans on board, you don't need the Democrats as much. And so we're seeing similar dynamics play out, why we have this sort of crisis, this governing by crisis, but the underlying dynamics have actually shifted a fair amount. over the last couple of years.
I do want to point out something you said at the top is that, deadlines as reporters, we can understand deadlines. And that's very true of Congress as well, because we were saying this off camera a little bit ago. But next week, there is a recess planned for Congress. And the last time we were in this position of a looming shutdown, it was a few days before Christmas. So to our listeners, that is sometimes by design, because it is the carrot at the end of the stick that the staff want to go home, lawmakers want to go home. They already have their schedules booked in their district. So they usually want to get out of town when they said they were going to get out of town. And that is likely an indicator that they could come to a deal, although we have seen it before where they have decided to stay in over the weekend at night to get the government funding deals done.
Or, the punt for a week, right? Just by time of what a shutdown. And it is worth reminding, because everyone, I think this is such a good question to tee up, but we were here in late December going into Christmas, and you're right, that we are operate on the fiscal year, September 30th, but we just literally did this 3 months ago. And the reason we're in this situation is because Mike Johnson needed the votes to get reelected as speaker. And so he wanted to do a full year extension, but he couldn't get the votes to do it. Elon Musk, remember, blew it up by talking about what a terrible deal it was. So they ended up just extending it to March 15th, which is now why we're in this situation again, and it's funny because you have Democrats on the Hill who are like, let's do a 1 month extension, which would mean that we're back in the same position in a month. And for Democrats, that's fine because they want to just run down the clock and get Republicans to be focused on just trying to basically fund the government. But these really short-term CRs have become totally crazy.
Well, and this is a situation here where they being Republicans, they need some Democratic votes because they only have 53 votes in the Senate. You need 60 votes to get this through. So that's also created some issues here. I do just want to briefly piggyback onto something you mentioned earlier, James, which is how partisan things are, because you do have a sizable faction, especially of the House Republican caucus, that will not vote traditionally for any of these spending bills if it does not have substantial cuts in them. And that does really get back to kind of the breakdown of the appropriations process. The stat that gets thrown out there all the time is we have not passed all 12 appropriations bills on time since 1996. Which is a wild stat to think about, right? We've gone almost 3 decades now without doing that. On top of that, that would normally go through these appropriations committees where these rank and file members are. But not only has that process broken down, but the amendment process is broken down. There's a huge gripe, especially of far right Republicans in the House. But when the House brings a bill to the floor, there's a rule process for how many amendments can be offered. And I think something that really encapsulates this whole thing is when Paul Ryan became Speaker in 2015, he said, we're going to open up the process. The process has been closed for too long. We got to get rank and file members to offer amendments. When Paul Ryan left the speakership at the end of 2018, he had one open rule his entire speakership. That means that there was only one time where members could go down to the floor in those 3 or 4 years there and offer an unlimited number of amendments to bills. Every other time, that's a controlled process. And this gets back to the shutdown and the appropriations because, again, members view this as a leverage point, and then leadership tries to throw these deadlines, whether it's Christmas or whether it's a retreat or whatnot, kind of what we call jet fumes here in D.C., right, of folks want to get out of town, and that becomes the carrot at the end of the stick.
Yeah, I want to get into quickly about what Republicans are gaining from this, what this looks like for them, and is it on them as one party to pass this bill? Because as it stands right now, and we don't yet know because they will be voting later today after we are recording this, but they can only lose one vote on this. Republicans can. Yeah. So is it the role of just one party to pass the bill? Is that where we are at right now?
Well, I will say, when Democrats have controlled the House, they have been able to pass it on party line vote. They've been able to get it through, but Republicans have not, because of all these people that JM's talking about. And I appreciate how you're taking a pretty wonky in the weed subject and really explaining it in a very accessible way, because it can get confusing when you hear terms like regular order and amendment tree and all that. And in this situation, Republicans have the narrowest majority, I think, in 100 years. And so Mike Johnson really can only spare one vote. And the fact that Mike Johnson is telling reporters ahead of this vote that he thinks he's only going to lose one person, which is going to be Thomas Massey from Kentucky, is pretty remarkable. Even yesterday, there were a bunch of holdouts because people want their leverage. Beth Van Dyne from the Dallas area, she said she wasn't sold. And Trump has taken over the Republican Party, where people do fear him now. And Trump doesn't even need to sort of make this threat explicit. They know that if they vote against this, they're going to be seen as voting against Trump, and Trump is more popular than them in their districts. I mean, the Senate is interesting because Rand Paul has said he's going to vote no. He's the Republican from Kentucky, libertarian. He's against the tariffs. He's against the spending, but he's also he's been a Trump supporter. So that means you would need 8 Senate Democrats to vote yes out of 47. And so you really don't need all Democrats to get on board, but you just need 8 who are going to be like, I don't want to get blamed for a shutdown, or there's a lot of federal workers in my state who are going to be furloughed or whatever. Usually the Republicans or the Democrats, whoever's in charge, end up negotiating with the other side to get the votes. And so I think a lot of Democrats feel like this is kind of a unpleasant situation because the government either shuts down, but they aren't going to get what they want. They don't.
And they could be blamed for it as well.
Totally.
And so let's talk about the Democrats a little bit. I know everyone's been saying, oh, they don't have a cohesive message. There's no unity. I've actually been saying there is unity when it comes to something like this. And this is a big deal because they have all said, we are voting together as a party. Republicans, you're on your own. Democrats feel that this type of deal may have some things in it that are yet to be seen, such as cuts to entitlements, or may open the door to that, or further cuts with the federal government workforce, cuts to health care. So Democrats say they're a little worried about this, and so they are all going to not vote for it. So do they win anything if they stand together like this and are challenging Republicans to figure it out on their own?
Yeah, I mean, this is really one of the few moments where Democrats have some leverage. As we've been talking about how Democrats are sort of in soul searching mode of what do they do? How hard do they push back against Trump and the Trump administration? But, you've heard mixed messaging from Democrats on this as well, which is we need the government to stay open because of the services for constituents. And that ultimately just harms them and doesn't, necessarily mean that much for us on the political front. For kind of their base, the base wants to see Democrats fighting here, putting up a fight, getting concessions out of Republicans, out of the Trump administration, specifically on holding Elon Musk and Doge a little more to account, and also to prevent some of the kind of marginal cuts that are in this CR that gets them through September here. I think that what's interesting about this dynamic is that traditionally in recent years when we've been talking about this, it's are Republicans going to vote to keep the government open? Because Republicans would need to come on board. The last 2 government shutdowns were both under Trump when Republicans controlled both chambers. So now we're in a dynamic where Republicans still control both chambers, but now it's are Democrats going to vote to keep the government open? Because they do need those 8 votes if Rand Paul votes against this in the Senate. Because even if this gets through the House today, on a party line vote, how many Senate Democrats think that this is the fight to have right now? And to your earlier point, James, which I think is exactly right, if they punt this a month, is their leverage going to be any different in a month, or is this just about sort of stringing that along and forcing Trump to expend more political capital to keep this in line?
The master at this, Rhonda, to your question, is Nancy Pelosi. She was able to, by keeping, this from being there and covering all these fights, but Pelosi could hold all of her members together, even when Republicans had like a 20-seat, 30-seat majority. And then when there were 30 defections, Pelosi could say, well, if you want to single one of my members, you're going to have to make these major concessions. And then they'd have to come hat in hand to Pelosi, and Pelosi would drive a really hard bargain because she kept her members in line. So far, for being the new leader, Hakeem Jeffries is doing a good job of holding his members together in hopes of getting leverage because Republicans can't all fall in line and they have such a narrow majority. What'll be interesting is if the bill's going to pass anyway, are there a couple House Democrats from swing districts? I'm thinking of someone like Jared Golden from Maine, who wants to sort of vote for the bill, but if he's the deciding vote, doesn't want to undermine Leader Jeffries. in his leverage. That's when the majorities are this close, all of a sudden every member of Congress becomes like a senator. We spend so much time talking about the Susan Collinses of the world, but right now the House is basically like anyone in the House can act like a senator if they want. And that makes Mike Johnson's job a heck of a lot harder.
It does. And I noticed when he came to the cameras and the microphones earlier today, he already was blaming Democrats for it, which also tells me, and this is something that's really fascinating right now, is they will take this vote to the floor without a confident whip count. And they did that in December, where the first vote, it didn't go anywhere because they had not done a whip count and knew if their members were going to pass it. So I think we are also in new times there, where they are taking votes to the floor without knowing if they have everyone. And that makes this really a nail biter. I will add, to just tie up this segment on what's happening with the shutdown and what it all means. I did a story last year on why do we keep talking about looming shutdowns? It feels more frequent than it used to. And the expert I spoke with, who follows Congress at the Brookings Institute, she said, actually, looming shutdowns, it's common in congressional politics. She said, but what's uncommon is that we can't really tie this to any specific policy. And that is interesting, because she pointed out when there was one during the Obama administration, it was over the Affordable Care Act. When even in Trump's first administration, there was the shutdown over the border walls. We were always able to tie it back to one specific policy that people had problems with. Right now, it's just politics and math. It's really not that there is a big problem with one piece of policy. It is that the margins are just so slim, and at least in the House.
Really good point.
Yeah. So
and Republicans want, this is early in the Trump administration. That's kind of the last thing that a lot of these Republicans, and definitely the Trump administration, wants at this point, is that sort of quick shutdown, to your point.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, next up, we are going to talk about someone who is on the Hill to help Republicans keep it together and get to the floor and all vote in unity. And that's J.D. Vance. He had a closed-door meeting with House GOP members. We're going to talk a little bit about Vance, who he's becoming. What does his vice presidency look like when we come back? Okay, Vice President J.D. Vance was on Capitol Hill today to meet with House Republicans about the budget. James, I want to get a sense from you. J.D. Vance was on the Hill as a senator not long ago, months ago, actually.
2 years ago, but just for 2 years.
For 2 years, but just months ago. So he was recently there. At the time, he didn't really seem like a power broker senator, and really there wasn't enough time to build relationships. But now he's on the Hill right now as a person who is part of the negotiations, standing in for the White House. What do we make about how he is being received on the Hill and his relationships right now?
It has been remarkable to watch. Even today, as he was on the Hill, people were sharing some of his not very old tweets, honestly, from like 2019, where he was trashing Trump. And it's really been quite a journey when you look at it, the trajectory from never Trumper, Trump critic saying Trump was America's Hitler, to running as the MAGA candidate in the crowded Republican Senate primary, winning in the spring of 2022, the primary, then winning the election, coming in 2023, and sort of immediately becoming a thorn in the side of Mitch McConnell, and being very much part of the kind of anti-establishment crowd, the anti-internationalist crowd. But because of his past, he has been viewed very dubiously by MAGA. Like a lot of MAGA people, and we saw a lot of that last summer after he was named, just haven't seen him as one of them. They've seen him as an interloper who's sort of faking it. And I think that has really started to change. I think a really big turning point was that Oval Office meeting with Volodymyr Zelensky, where Vance really seemed to be the one who, shivved Zelensky and started the fight. Trump was sort of wrapping up the meeting, said, I'll take one more question. And then Vance started lighting into Zelensky. And then I think Zelensky saw Vance as someone who he could punch at because he felt like he couldn't hit at Trump, but he could hit at Vance. And then Trump came to Vance's defense, and it kind of blew up into this big thing. But I think that when you talk to MAGA world, that like Don Jr. loves JD. He's Don Jr. more than anyone else is why JD became vice president. But JD has really won over the MAGA base. And so he has credibility to go over there. And even, I mean, it's having covered the Hill for a while, the people who are the most defiant and the biggest thorns in the side of Republican leadership for years, not just members, but staffers, like the staffers for members of the House Freedom Caucus. They are now the top people in the White House Office of Legislative Affairs.
Yeah.
So I saw the video of JD, leaving the Hill, and he's being followed by a bunch of staff. And it's like, these are the people who were like angling to shut down the government last year. These are the people who were like the burn it all down crowd. And Vance is gotten in with them. And that's why they sent Vance to sort of go twist those arms. He's not, JD Vance isn't going to persuade Mitch McConnell to vote for anything, but he can get to these MAGA types who see him, one, as speaking for the president, but two, is one of them. And it really is a remarkable shift in a very short amount of time for him to get that.
Yeah. So that's sort of like where he is with, those who share the same ideologies as him, other politicians. But I'm also wondering how the public is viewing JD Vance. I want to play a clip, though, first. This is from over the weekend in Cincinnati, Ohio, where JD Vance was spending the weekend at his home there.
Forcing both the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Right, you won't settle.
Exactly. They certainly invaded Ukraine in 2022.
And
But there needs to be a settlement.
Chechnya.
Ma'am,
We are the aggressor every time.
ma'am, I understand that that's your view, and certainly they have, and certainly,
How many other countries?
I have condemned, ma'am, please, you're interrupting. I'm speaking with you, and I'm trying to be respectful. I have condemned the invasion.
Okay, that clip has been getting a lot of play over the last few days. And just for some context, that happened near his neighborhood. He has said that the protesters were following him. They have said they already had a planned protest in support of Ukraine. And this is important to mention, this is his home state too, where they are having protests. And they said they did not realize he would be there. They just kind of happened upon him. So the accounts there differ, but they both said, Vance as well as the protesters said, that it was peaceful. But he is being tied right now to the issue of Ukraine. And I'm just wondering, JM, what do you think about how the public is viewing Vance after that Oval Office meeting and right now in this moment?
One of the things that Trump liked the most about Vance as he was kind of weighing his VP picks over the summer was that Vance was good on television, in Trump's words. He would go on any network and he would basically do combat with the host or with whoever the other guests were and would defend MAGA and would defend Trump. And he wanted someone like that by his side. That was a factor in all of this. So when we see moments like this, I can't help but think back to that, because in some ways, Vance, I'm sure, wants some of this. I'm not saying that he wants it, yeah, started this or what, there's mixed accounts of what happened, but I think this plays well for Vance and for Trump's base here. On Ukraine, it's very interesting because Vance, for a few years there, as he was both first running as a candidate and then once he was in the Senate, would go on Tucker Carlson's Fox show a lot. And Tucker was really one of the first people in the mainstream cable news network kind of ecosystem to come out against or cast doubt on Ukraine and on the war and on U.S. involvement over their U.S. support for Ukraine. And Vance very much, they kind of played off of each other in that regard. And to have that come full circle now to the Oval Office from a few weeks ago now with that interaction with Zelensky is really kind of a striking turn. And you can't help but wonder how much Vance has kind of swayed some of Trump's thinking on that matter as well. And the last thing I'll just point out on this is we've noted how Trump and some of his cabinet officials have really shifted their tone, even in recent months, definitely over the last 3 years here, on the issue of Ukraine, not even being willing to say that Russia was the aggressor in some cases. You heard in that clip there that Vance said that, yes, Russia invaded Ukraine, which that alone is news, which is remarkable that that's news, right? Fact, but it's news in the world that we live in now. And you know, Vance is still trying to, by all accounts, he's still trying to kind of find his way a little bit in terms of what his lanes are going to be. He's overseeing this TikTok deal that may or may not happen. And every vice president has this happen. But, the Vance is coming in with very distinct views that I think play to Trump and to MAGA world, but also on the issue of Ukraine, I do think have the chance of kind of shaping that and kind of carving out a new space there.
James, you said that he does want this, and I just want to read some polling that I found earlier today. This was taken from March 8th. It's an Emerson poll, and his unfavorability is at 46%. The economists in YouGov have him at 48% unfavorability among the Americans polled there. So it seems as if he's about half there, that half of the public doesn't view him favorably, the other half does. Is the moves he's making, whether it's being outspoken about backing away from Ukraine and some of the other things, his Munich speech, are these by design? It's just not how he's feeling and off the cuff. Do you feel that this is by design?
I think it is how he's feeling. It's not off the cuff. I do think it's definitely by design. Two things to clarify. When I say he wants it, I think he wants the fight. He's happy to have the fight.
Yeah,
I actually don't think he wanted the harassment in the streets of Cincinnati. I mean, he was with his kid. He was walking around the weekend before. He was skiing in Vermont, and there were large scale protests and people sort of in his face. Or the face of the motorcade. So I don't think he likes that. I mean, but I think he's happy to mix it up. Right now, Vance is thinking about the 2028 Republican primaries, not the 2028 general. And he wants to be the Republican nominee. He wants to inherit the Trump coalition and carry the torch. And a few weeks ago, Trump was on Fox News and was asked, "Is Vance your successor?" And he said no very quickly, and said, "Well, there's going to be a lot of people who want it, and I think a bunch of people in the cabinet want to run." And so Vance is trying to tie himself close to Trump, win over the MAGA crowd, and right now I think that's his game. It's not be liked or popular, and in some ways looking like a fighter will endear him to the very people he will need, including Trump, to become the Republican nominee. And it's sort of, I mean, those numbers are sort of on par with Trump's numbers too. It's hard to see.
Trump's unfavorability with the Economist poll is at 52%.
Yeah.
So a little higher than Vance actually there.
That's really good. That's really interesting.
Well, and if we harken back to the campaign, right, especially right after Trump picked Vance and the numbers were a little underwater or a little shaky, right? They weren't getting the same bump that you would usually get right after picking a vice presidential candidate. And then he had a couple kind of stumbles on the trail, or maybe some lines that just didn't land. And there was chatter about, okay, A, should he replace Vance? And B, is this going to drag down the ticket? Obviously, neither happened. But I think that's carrying through here, and that may have been what drove Trump to kind of quickly say, no, he's not my successor. And then he tried to kind of caveat and clarify it. Vance's main thing that he's done right now for the administration is getting those cabinet nominations through the Senate, right? He was up there with almost all of them, I think, interacting with senators, kind of assuaging concerns that, especially the controversial ones, some senators had with them. And the fact that all of Trump's cabinet nominees that have been put up for a vote have gotten through is quite remarkable, given where we were 2 months ago on some of these. Now, how much you attribute that directly to Vance, kind of the backdoor work that he did lobbying, is maybe a little bit of an open question. But to your point, that's kind of the first step, and him kind of standing by Trump's side. Trump wants someone who wanted someone who was going to be a loyalist and who wasn't going to overshadow him in the vice presidency, and Vance is doing that.
And traditionally, the VP plays that attack dog role.
Yes.
That's, going back, they're the person. Trump loves being the attack dog, but Vance is sort of doing what a vice president historically does do.
All right, James, JM, thank you. That is it for us today. You can join us here on Sidebar on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I'm Rhonda Colvin for the Washington Post.